Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. My name is Mark Aylward, and I'm here as always with my good friend, colleague, and co-host, Jim Gurule. Yeah, an interesting pregame, Jim. We got off on quite a few different tangents, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the topic for today is going to, at the core, is going to be self-sovereignty, the having absolute ownership and control over your life, and it kind of stemmed from a couple conversations we were having about our respective relationships and our respective ages, and how you like to say that life comes at us in 5 year increments or decade increments. And it was funny because I think you're 61 and I'm about to be 65. And I think it became a discussion of how different our relationships, whether that's a sexual relationship, a romantic relationship, a friendship, or whatever, how the dynamics of those things change as we get older and we change. And then we talked a little bit about some of the distinctions between how women think about these things and how men think about these things. And it was rather interesting, but it was rather multifaceted. So hopefully we can stay on topic here. And I'll read the definition. But before I do that, why don't you go ahead and toss your 2 cents in there? Did I get that right?
Yeah, you did. And like you said, as we do every week, we have a pregame. We try to use our framework. It's the Imperfect Men's Club. The imperfection is the perfection. So it's known that it's never perfect. But using our framework and um, the center of these 5 areas of our life is starts with the self. So as the episodes, particularly this year, have evolved, we really focus on self-awareness. And as a man, particularly at mid 30s, mid 40s, mid 50s, self-awareness is probably the most important thing. And then the assumption is that we're aware, self-aware of these other 5 areas of our life, in no particular order, but often it leads with our life's work. It's our career. In our case, we have different stages of your life, but typically it's your profession, it's your career. That's part of what we're doing with the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. Then the other area is our relationship with ourselves. That's our mental well-being and our physical well-being. So our health, mental health, physical health. Talked a lot about that even in the pregame, right? About
Hmm.
the difference between happiness and wholeness is that people think they're happy short term, but they're not whole and they're not truly fulfilled. And it's something that just continues to seem to get worse for men and women, but particularly men. And that ties right into our self-worth. But the other part of the life that we often forget is that our relationship with the world, so our worldview, and that has everything to do with our childhood, so our heritage, our spiritual beliefs, and then also our politics, the red team, the blue team, and what information that we're consuming every day of the week is going to affect how we see the world and our self-awareness. And then our relationship with money. And that's typically in two different areas, abundance and scarcity. What is this is all, and we'll talk about this, is that a lot of this has to do with our relationship with our others. And in the other category is our relationship with others is men and women. So I would say today, Mark, today this is going to fall in our relationship with others, and that's uh, female. Of course, our mothers, our sisters, our aunts, but most significant, our significant others, whether that's a wife or a girlfriend, and how that plays out every day, and how it's such an important part of who we are as a man and who as they are as a woman. But I'm gonna let you come in on this because I know even in your book you're writing about this, right? The roles have changed so much in our lifetime. It's difficult sometimes to know what our role is as a man, and I think it's difficult for women to know what their role is too. So we don't frame this in a negative way. It's just we use the podcast to talk about this. And when I was doing a deep dive on libido and how that's related to who we are, our self worth as a man, um, this word self sovereignty came up, and that's what we're going to get into deep into. So.
Yeah, let me read the definition that you found. Self-sovereignty is the concept of having absolute authority, ownership, and control over one's own life, body, and personal data, emphasizing independence and self-governance. It involves taking full responsibility for decisions, setting boundaries, and operating from internal guidance rather than external validation. Yeah, it's an interesting topic in the context of being in a committed relationship. I mean, you're in a long-term marriage and a relationship prior to that, and I'm in a 7-year relationship with my girlfriend. And I would say, not to put words in your mouth, that our full intentions are to be with this person for whatever forever means. However, there's this bumping up against, we would love the support and the validation from this person, this other person, but we're also responsible for our own well-being and our own decisions. So it was the conversation we were having was kind of, well, how do you balance these two things at the same time? What are you expecting out of the other person? And what are you truly going to be responsible for in terms of your own well-being? Because there are certain decisions I'm sure that you want her to be involved in, and others that you make independently, and that's between the two of you. The same thing holds true for me. But yeah, and then we started getting into some of the Carl Jungian stuff, the
Yeah.
libido and specific and sexual energy versus romantic energy versus friendship energy. It's we could go a lot of different ways with this, so I'm not sure what lane you want to stay in.
I want to stay in this lane at the moment because, like you said, it could go a lot of different directions, but it always seems to come back to the same lane, which is libido, which is sex, because it's
Mhm.
such an important part of who we are as a man. And this also goes back to self-awareness, the drivers in a relationship. Um, what I'm learning through the Carl Jung's writings is that as a man, and again, it's not that we um, need women for this, but this is what our drivers are. This is what makes us feel our best is when you have this sexual energy that a woman gives us by
Mhm.
validating us, and we do the same for them. But what this means though is that there is a dynamic with anybody you're in a relationship with, and sex is a huge part of that. So the libido is something that's typically talked about, as like, hey, it's sex. No, it's not just sex. There's a lot that goes into that for both a man and a woman, and being self-aware. And what we talked about in the pregame is how much that changes over time. Because when you're 20 years old, that's a very different conversation because your main role as a human is to reproduce, right? Is to and that the difference between, to your point earlier about a 20-year old having the conversation, or and a 30-year-old versus a 40-year-old and a 50-year-old. I think we both agree it's still very, very important. So the
Well, it
question
is,
is,
yeah. And we were talking about alluding to some guys that we know, some well, maybe some less well, that are, the male world seems to be split in two. Some guys have issues with that that they reach after they reach a certain age, and other guys don't. And to me, maybe it's an ignorant way to look at it, but I think it's a matter of, are you physically fit or are you not physically fit? And
Mhm.
but the validation from the other is, it's really interesting. And I was talking about it because I'm 7 years in. Not to be careful about how I say this, but the romantic phase is in its entirety is not over, but as a core phase, it is. We know who we are. She
Mhm.
knows who I am. I know who she is. Frailties, flaws,
Mhm.
strengths, blemishes, the whole nine yards.
Mhm.
And when you get to that point in a relationship, things change.
Mhm.
Maybe not dramatically, but maybe dramatically. And one of the
Yeah.
things that kept coming back into the discussion that we have is the most important thing seems to be the ability to continue conversations, even about things that we might disagree about. Because once the
Mhm.
conversation stops, you're on your own.
Yeah. Mark, but there's some clarity to something that never changes. What is a woman attracted to in a man? And it's what we're going to talk about today. It's their independence. It's that they don't need anybody, that they are the strength, that when you start to like them more than they like you, they actually lose sexual attraction. It is a really interesting dynamic. And if you show too much, um, if you give them too much of your power, they don't respect you. And
Yep.
it's not a criticism. This is just a reality. And so it's hard because what they're telling you and what they want often is different.
Well, it totally. It's a great and interesting topic because I think that ironically, one of the things that's happening in the culture now is that men are being kind of dumbed
Yep.
down and emasculated,
Hmm.
and the women that are doing that and the men that are allowing it to be done because they're both responsible, are going to end up with something they don't want, that what they don't want as much as they thought they would. Because
Yeah.
you're right, independence, strength, decisiveness, providing, supporting,
Yep.
solving problems, all of these things are attractive. But what culture has done, what American society
Hmm.
in particular has done, is they've emasculated the
Yep.
man. And no one had, feminism came in 60s, maybe 70s, depending on what your viewpoint is. I suppose late 60s is, and that was a discussion. And this is my humble opinion. Women
Hmm.
need equal rights to men, and they haven't been getting them, and we need to fix that. And it's a tough argument.
I think we're in the right direction. I think
Yeah, I think it's
there's
a
not a single
difficult.
law on the books that does that. So,
No, I think that, but I think that in my opinion, because I'm investigating this, as you know, for the writing of my book, is
right,
what is happening with men,
right.
so that I can help some of these guys that are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s that are, got punched in the face with a divorce or, breakup or whatever, and they're lost, they're floating around lost, and they need some assistance with that. What's next? But I
Mhm.
think that, so we have this discussion about feminism, but we never turned around and said, okay, guys, this is where your adjustments are going to come in. This is what you can expect from this. If we in fact do this,
Mhm.
and women go to work more, they go to college more, they get more degrees,
Right.
they equalize themselves in the provider household roles. What are you guys going to do?
Yeah.
When
Well,
no one ever had that conversation,
no,
you
this is
know?
super important. They've also become more like men by behavior.
Hmm.
So this is where things really become, in fairness to them, somewhat confusing because what they've been told to be is to be independent and not to need a man has turned them into a man to some degree. And has turned the men into, so maybe here's a better way of describing it. The masculinity and femininity roles have blended together. Now, it doesn't mean though, that the sexual energy is a part of a an attraction of something that you want from somebody else, and women still are attracted to men that are independent, that don't need them, that have their own lives, and that's kind of the starting point. Whether they're self-aware of it or not, and that's also the sexual tension that creates romance. It creates a lot of different, um, yeah, dynamics. So again, I think we're not off topic in talking about uh, the importance of sexual energy for both the man and a woman. We're just getting a little more clear on what that looks like later on in life or different stages of the relationship. So, but
Well,
let's break these down. I give you five areas to deeper dive on self sovereignty. I think we can learn from that as we go through that, how it applies, whether it's relationships or just life in general.
yeah, what we've done here with these 5 points is break that self-sovereignty definition up into 5 kind of subset topics
Hmm.
underneath the umbrella of self-sovereignty. And the
Hmm.
first one looks like, this concept of having absolute authority, ownership, and control over one's own life, body, and personal data, the ultimate form of independence and self-governance. Is, I guess the question for me would be, if the desire is to be self-sovereign, in control of all of your life and decisions and so on, where's the space for your partner? How do you bring her into those conversations so she feels supported and involved, and not left out, or isolated? I think it's an interesting question.
Well, it's an interesting question that if you don't go out and create your own life independently, whether it's your career, whether it's going to the gym, it's eating well, they'll lose attraction in you. That's just the
Yes.
way it is.
Hmm.
So, again, I think the conversation when it comes to a relationship, my takeaway is it's the importance of holding on to your independence and your self-worth. And often they'll ask you to do things that are for their best interest and not necessarily yours. And men, whether it's by how they were raised or social construct, sometimes give them everything they want, and often those relationships end. That's why the
It
divorce rate
has
is
the,
like
yeah,
80% of the women file for divorce. Why is that? Yeah. Often the men gave them exactly what they wanted and then they still left them. It happens all the time.
yeah, it is. It is interesting. There's this notion of self-respect,
Mhm.
right? And like if you take a stance, it's like I say to my kids, my girls in particular, I'm never going to move off of one of my stances, one of my values to
Mhm.
appease you. Because if I were to try and appease you, I would lose a piece of myself. You would
Mhm.
notice that and it would
Yep.
disturb you. You'd
And
lose
that's why
respect
she's
for me.
attracted to you,
Yes.
even though she's still going to try to talk you off those. If you give in, it's a very delicate. It's difficult, right? Because you can, as a man, you can also be too dominating and not self-aware that you're so what is it, rigid or stuck in your ways that you become unattractive because you're not willing to compromise. But maybe to your point, it doesn't mean you compromise your values. You may learn about something together and then change your opinion, but there's your true values shouldn't change who you are, your
And
integrity.
and and your significant other shouldn't ask you to change in regard to that. I mean, it's one thing to get into a relationship, coming to an agreement on the most important values, like the religion you're going to practice, whether you're going to have kids or not, who's going to make the money,
Just
all the important stuff. And then like later on in life, we're going to move that target. Like that
Yeah,
doesn't
that's what they do. That's kind
yeah.
of how it goes. Yeah. So that's called a relationship, and that's the difference between again, a man and a woman and their own self-interest, So anyway, let's go to the next one because I think we're gonna
Yeah,
have some
well, I
fun
mean,
with this one.
we're all in Maslow's hierarchy. We're all trying to survive, you know.
Yeah.
Number two is shifting from external validation to internal
Yeah.
guidance, and the psychological shift required to move away from seeking permission or validation from the outside world. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. This ties into even our topic last week about being driven by the ego. And I think
Hmm.
in your earlier years, you are driven by your ego. As you get older, then you become a little more mission driven, and you're taught you want to offer your wisdom and to the world, and it's less about your ego. Ego is a huge driver for everybody. We're selfish beings. That's by nature, and of course, we want to be recognized and be valued. So
Well, it's an
the ego
interesting.
never goes away, but I think you become less driven by just what people think and more driven about.
Well, I mean, that's the goal. Where they say comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah, yeah,
You don't
yeah,
want to be comparing yourself to other people. And my dad has a saying about this. He says, I walk into a room with 10 people in there. Two people are going to love me. Two people are going to hate me, and the other six aren't even going to know I'm there.
yeah,
So it's one of my favorite things. And my brother does a good job of basically taking the position I don't really give a fuck what anyone else thinks of me. And although I don't believe that to be 100% true,
right,
he's as close to 100% as anybody I've ever met.
yeah.
And he's also
I,
kind and respectful, and he's not an asshole, but he's just not going to. He has a real good grip on this number two subtopic here, which is my happiness comes from within and from God, and the stuff circling on around me on the outside. I can let it bother me, but I'm going to try not to because it really is not relevant.
yeah,
You
yeah. The
know?
word self sovereignty is becoming more visual in that you're true you're authentic. You're staying true to who you are, and you're not going to let somebody change that um, based on the topic or what the flavor of the month is, either politically or for other
Well,
reasons.
you
And
listen
yeah,
and you try to discover And to your point earlier, if you discover new information, then you have the right to change your mind or your position or your worldview or whatever it might be.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I think that if you look to, there's two kinds of people in the world. I said this to you in the pregame. There's people that when something goes wrong, they ask themselves what they could have done differently to perhaps preclude that from happening, or what might they be able to shift so that it doesn't happen again. They're personally accountable. They're self-sovereign. And
Mhm.
the other group of people, and there's too many of these people, is when something goes wrong, the first thing they do, and it's not a decision that they mull over. It's an instinctive reaction. Whose fault was this? Or what happened that's not my fault that made this happen. They seek blame. So you
Mhm.
go external or you go internal, and I think internal is a much safer, more healthier way to go, because that's where all this good stuff is.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
outside stuff's noise.
Yeah.
More often than not.
Mhm.
So number three, taking full responsibility for decisions. Um, you know, the weight of sovereignty, it says, involves taking full responsibility for every decision made. This is also interesting in the context of relationships, and
Mhm.
in this case, wives and girlfriends. And that is, well, are there any decisions, because we are a couple, we are a pair, are there any decisions that we must make together, or can we make all of our decisions on our own? My experience is there's a few that need to be made together, and they're usually just the big ones, you know.
Mhm.
But the day-to-day stuff, I function well in a relationship where she's independent but likes to spend time with me and would prefer to be with me, but is perfectly comfortable being on her own. And I
Mhm.
think the reverse is true as well. I don't know if there's a big difference in your mind, Jim, between a man and a woman with regard to, taking responsibility, making decisions together, or making them independently. But I got into a few good brawls with my ex by making big decisions without her, although I had been doing that for many, many years. And one day something changed and I wasn't told.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know how I feel about solitude. I seek and value solitude. Not everybody does, but I think that's just a big part. But to your point, women in general prefer to have people around. Maybe not all the time, but they're more communal. They want to have people around them, and that's, I think, just by nature. As I find that what also we're talking about is self-control and self-disciplines, where you're not depending on the outside world for your satisfaction or your to be happy, or to be, well, not happy, for wholeness. You're not seeking
Wholeness.
outside, and those people by nature are much more attractive. You value those are good leaders, right? Do you know
Mm-hmm.
that if they say something, um, they mean it, it's not going to change. I find one of the most challenging things right now, and this is just again more of a culture, maybe where I live, is when you have a conversation with somebody and they change their position in based on who they talk to next. Those are the worst people to deal with, because you don't know whether what they said, the next time they say something, you don't know if it's going to change again. So you may not like the answer, but at least if somebody gives me an answer that I know is not going to change, I can make my decisions and move forward and make progress. But
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree. I think what makes me think about one of my initial reactions to AI, because when I first started using it was ChatGPT, and one of the first things it did was kiss my ass, right? And I'm like, I don't think anybody who really has self-sovereignty, self-respect, self-awareness
well, right.
wants anybody to kiss their ass.
Not, eventually you don't respect them. It's a good
No.
example I was saying. And women are no different. If you give them exactly what they want, pretty soon you don't value it. It's not just women. That's not fair. I think it's like, to your point, it's human nature. You don't value something that you don't have to work for, or you know the outcome, um, just because they're trying to appease you. It lowers their value. It elevates theirs and lowers yours. Very related to
Yeah, yeah. I
self-sovereignty.
mean, and again, that's a good point that you snuck in there, and I don't want to blow by it, because human nature is a thing,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of these things that we're talking about are built into us, like at a DNA level.
Yeah.
The nurturing instincts of a woman versus the isolationist instincts of a man versus, the hunter-gatherer instincts of a man versus the emotional capacity of a woman or the multitasking capability. We used to celebrate these things, and now we're making them like bad.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
I told you earlier, I didn't date anybody for 10 years. And so I was alone for 10 years, but I was never lonely.
Mhm.
There's a big difference between those two things, man. I think
Yeah. There's,
you have to figure out how to enjoy your own company or you're fucked, you
yeah.
know?
This is a couple of years ago. I was on this kick. I don't know, but it was the saying. Do you know what everybody wants? Everybody wants the same thing. You know
Hmm.
what it is?
To be wanted.
What they don't have.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's human nature. And
Yeah.
when you don't have it, then you seek it more. So if you're single and you're looking for somebody, you want it even more. It's it applies to everything in life. It's just like you said, it's the way the human mind is wired to once it has it, it moves on to something else.
Yeah.
It's back to self-awareness. And not always for your own good. That's what an addiction is. You
Hmm.
just want something and you want it more and more and more because you're running out or you want more. Doesn't mean it's healthy for you or it's productive in your life, but it is a driver. And even money, there's never enough, right? You want money to buy something there's never enough. So anyway, what's the next one? I don't want to run out of time before we get
Yeah. The
through
next
the.
one is setting and enforcing boundaries. So if you have absolute ownership of your life, you also have to have the discipline to decide what and who is allowed into your space.
Mhm.
This is a very interesting topic. I think that, that old adage that you are the culmination or the compilation of the five people that you spend the most time with. I think one of the things that I have been guilty of in my life is not saying no enough to
Mhm.
certain people. I am a bit of a people pleaser, ironically. And I don't like that. I don't like that. I like the fact that it makes me a kind person, but I don't like the fact that I'm going to allow people and have allowed people into my lives that were harmful to me. And I was more interested in making them happy than I was in making me happy. And I don't know if everyone that knows me would say that about me. Maybe I'm being a little harsh on myself, but I think there's a lot
Mhm.
of power in boundaries and as much who you let in as who you don't, you know?
Yeah, it's something recently. Somebody asked, I think I mentioned this before. Uh, they asked for advice, and I say I no longer give advice. I'll share perspective. I'll share my life lived experiences. They may or may not apply to you. I think wisdom always prevails over time. But when you were talking, what reminded me of this is it's not what you do in life. Sometimes it's more important what you don't do in life.
Mm-hmm.
And our obsession with doing uh, sometimes overrides to the point you're making, just saying no to certain things. I could look at my life even as when I was like 19, 20, especially the environment I was in at that time and younger, whether it was being part of the gang, that friends were going into that. I had cousins that were going that direction. Luckily, I started playing sports and I lived in a kind of different part of town where I didn't get as wrapped up in that. I did for a couple summers, but yeah, you go down that road, you never come back, right? Same with drugs
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there's all kinds of things that I didn't do that actually had a greater impact on my life than things that I did do. And I know people get caught up in that. Oh, you got to do this, you got to do this. No, sometimes to your point, Mark, it's what you don't do has
Yeah, it's, I think I'm thinking about like waves of different things that I did and didn't do during the course of my life. And I think most of the time we know what the right thing to do is. It feels like we do. And when I don't do the right thing, I know that I've done the wrong thing. But when I
well,
do the
sometimes you don't
right
know
thing,
until years later. So it's
yeah, yeah. And
don't be too hard on
maturity,
yourself.
yeah, maturity does forgiveness, self-forgiveness as we've talked about before. But I think
Yeah.
when you do the right thing, like showing up at the gym when you feel too tired, or making it to practice when you don't feel like it, or maybe you got a little bit of a cold coming on or whatever. When you overcome those temptations and end up doing the right thing, it's one of the most satisfying feelings that you can have,
Mhm.
and then you build on that. When we talk about this all the time, it's reps, man. It's like small incremental
It's
action over
self-discipline. It
time,
always comes back to self-discipline, which
self-discipline.
is
And
directly related to self-sovereignty. Yeah.
yeah, that's part of this number five, is the ability to discipline oneself. Self-regulation is what they refer to it here, but it's the same
Mhm.
thing.
It is. Yeah.
You don't, if you're looking for society or somebody else to make you feel okay,
No,
you're not going to feel okay.
no.
That's
It
not
has
the
to
way
come
the
from
world
within.
works.
Yeah. Yeah. It has to come within. That sounds easy, but it's not.
It's
There's,
well, I don't know. I don't mean to sound cliche, but I think this is true, is a truism and a phrase that I like, and that is, nothing that I've ever accomplished that I would consider worthwhile was easy.
yeah.
It's part of what makes it worthwhile, is got to work for it,
Yeah.
and that might
Yeah.
be a good way to wrap this up, unless you have any closing thoughts.
No, I think it's a great way to wrap it up, and it could tie into next week's topic too about self acclimate. I said it right? How did I say?
So alchemy, yeah,
Alchemy. Thank you.
it's a fancy name for chemistry on some level, I suppose.
Yeah, but it does tie into how we're going to wrap this up in terms of what you do with those negative experiences, those challenges. They really create who you are. That they're not failures. That they shape you in life. So I don't want to focus too much on everything you do as a mistake. Sometimes those mistakes also is comes from the greatest work that you do. Even like your book
Yeah,
and this podcast are from hardships that we have had, decided to do something with it. So,
I think
uh,
at the core of this, to conclude from my end, is everything's a choice,
sure.
and if you believe that everything's a choice, then you also kind of by default believe in all of the things that we talked about today, which is taking responsibility for your well-being.
Hmm.
That's a choice, and you can hand that choice away to other people, or you can hang on to that. And my vote is to hang on to that.
Yeah. Sounds good. All right,
Thanks,
Mark,
Jim.
until next week.
All right, see you, man.